Hello, and welcome to History 2023 Arkansas History. Lecture title Voices of Protest. One of the consequences of the New South era in Arkansas was that it set up something of a divide in the outlook of the citizens. Specifically, a divide between city dwellers, for whom things were generally looking up, and the rural majority, for whom things were definitely not looking up. If sharecropping and economic stagnation had been limited to this state alone, perhaps those conditions would have been suffered in silence, but as a matter of fact, they reflected problems on a broader national level, and for that reason, Arkansans in the late 19th and early 20th centuries were increasingly caught up in the protest movements agitating for social and political change. Though some of the specific issues were unique to Arkansas, as they were to other states as well, the prospects for American agriculture as a whole in the late 19th century were not especially rosy. The basic problems were those we looked at last week: overproduction, whether of cotton or corn or some other crop, driving down farm prices nationwide; the average farmer's increased reliance on railroads to take those crops to market, often getting screwed on shipping rates in the process; and the falling into debt and then tenant farming that resulted because of these trends. These were perhaps especially noticeable in the South because of the impoverishment that had followed the Civil War and Reconstruction, but they were happening in the Midwest and other regions as well. And unlike in Arkansas, where the Redeemer governments still tended to favor the interests of agriculture, albeit the planters rather than the small farmers, there was a feeling in those other regions that they were being forgotten as the power of American industry accelerated. Because of all these factors, some material, others psychological, farmers in most states were increasingly resentful of how their position seemed to be deteriorating and began organizing to demand reforms that would restore it. Now, it's not easy to give a clear-cut history of this agrarian protest movement in Arkansas, simply because farmers were not a monolithic category. You had planters, you had sharecroppers, you had independent yeoman farmers still, you had cotton growers, fruit growers, herders of livestock, etc. These groups did not have quite the same interests and were by no means united on everything. Still, though, there were a number of movements, whether local or national in origin, that they joined in with at times, if often for different reasons. The first step taken by Arkansas farmers came as far back as the early 1870s, when they began forming local chapters of a new national farmers organization known as the Grange. Essentially a self-help group, it sought to get around the power of the railroads, banks, and other middlemen by creating farming cooperatives, which would buy up and distribute the capital that farmers needed to turn a profit. Though not explicitly political in their program, Grange members also pushed for greater regulation of the railroads, specifically when it came to the rates they charged on the shipping of farm produce. This was a popular program, and by the autumn of 1875, the Grange claimed some 20,000 members throughout the state. However, it just as quickly went into decline. Members of the state government were certainly sympathetic to farmers' demands, but given the importance of the railroads in modernizing the state infrastructure, no one wanted to constrict them too much, so this call for regulation ultimately went nowhere. Farming co-ops were difficult to set up, too, and by the end of the decade, the Grange was already mostly a thing of the past in Arkansas. However, it cast a long influence. For one thing, most of the future leaders of agrarian reform in the state would be those who had cut their teeth as members of the Grange, meeting to discuss these issues and agitate for change, and for another, the early failure of the Grange itself would convince many of those leaders that they would have to become more directly political themselves to achieve lasting results. The various agrarian organizations formed in the years following the collapse of the Grange, some of them, like the Grange itself, would be chapters of broader national movements. These included most of the explicitly political parties that popped up throughout the 1870s and 1880s. There are too many of these to run through, but the most successful, for a time at least, was the Greenback Party, which began running candidates for office in 1878. It took its name from its call for the U.S. government to issue more paper money, commonly known then as greenbacks, with the deliberate intent of causing inflation. As supporters of the Greenback Party saw it, by increasing the amount of money in circulation, it would elevate farm prices and also make it easier for farmers to get out of debt, since the amount of debt would now be worth less than it originally was. The party's showing in the 1880 gubernatorial elections, in which its candidate got a very respectable 27% of the vote, showed that its message resonated with a lot of people. Like all the others, though, it was only addressing a single issue and proved unable to hold together over the long run, collapsing by 1884. Arkansas farmers were not only latching onto these national parties, however. All the time, they were creating their own homegrown movements, and for a while, it appeared these might succeed where the others had failed. Again, there were a lot of these. The Farmers Union, the Reform Society, the Sons of Liberty, and the Brothers of Freedom, a group originating in Johnson County that would win a number of local elections, sometimes by allying with the surviving Republican politicians. By far the one that outpaced the others, though, was the Agricultural Wheel. I included a document from this group in last week's readings, getting a bit ahead of myself in the process, because we're really going to deal with it now. Founded in Prairie County in 1882, the Wheel quickly went statewide, absorbing several of these other local organizations and developing a governing apparatus run by veterans of the Grange and of the Greenback Party. The platform of the Wheel was a mix of political and non-political ideas. On the one hand, it continued the old self-help theme, advocating education among its members about the latest agricultural developments, producing as many necessities oneself as possible to avoid falling into debt to merchants and/or railroads, and diversifying crop production. Farmers in northwest Arkansas, for example, were encouraged to switch over to growing fruit trees, which many of them were doing already, rather than trying their hand at cotton and falling into that trap. On the other hand, it made a number of proposals that were directly aimed at challenging the status quo. Beyond simply the increased taxation and regulation of the railroads and the expansion of the money supply, following the lead of the Greenbacks, it demanded, on a national level, the abolition of national banks to break the power of the great financial lobbies, a graduated or progressive income tax to break the power of the rich in general, and a lower tariff on foreign goods to give them more access to cheap manufactured items. Also, Wheel leaders increasingly made a point of reaching out to black farmers, going so far as to include a black delegation from St. Francis County in its 1887 state convention. Racial equality as such was not one of its objectives, but the Wheel was definitely looking to create a cross-racial coalition to challenge the forces it saw as responsible for farmers' oppression. Whether it would be successful in this challenge was very much an open question. Again, the state government was back in the hands of Democrats who were traditionally more sympathetic to agriculture. However, the political leadership was by no means friendly to such reform proposals as these. Not only did they see it as potentially threatening to this program of economic modernization, smothering it through taxes and regulation, but they themselves were typically planters owning large estates, not yeoman farmers or sharecroppers, increasingly living in town and allied with these emerging industrial interests. In short, they might get their income from their land, but they did not have the same outlook as members of these protest movements and were inclined to see them as a threat to their own and to the state's future. Talk of raising taxes or government spending was considered a disaster waiting to happen, given what had happened during Reconstruction, and regulating the railroads, it was feared, would kill the economic recovery going on if it led said railroads to abandon the state. So for these reasons, the Democratic leadership was not very willing to put the demands of the Wheel and other groups into action. In order to placate them somewhat, the state legislature did enact a few reforms in the late 1880s. Some of the railroad shipping rates were capped, taxes on them were raised slightly, and various forms of business monopolies were outlawed. Most of the more drastic demands for reform were ignored or put off, though, and in the eyes of Wheel leaders, this was simply not enough to significantly improve matters. As a result, the movement shifted from being essentially a pressure group within the Democratic Party to splitting from it altogether, forming what they hoped would be a permanent third party in the state that could take the reins of power and enact reform directly. There was at least a reasonable chance that they would be able to do so. Large numbers of poorer farmers in the state were still resentful at their declining position, after all, and the outreach to black farmers meant the Wheel might be able to siphon off support from Democrats and Republicans alike. Moreover, during the late 1880s, the organization began looking to ally with an entirely different group of the discontented in Arkansas, the industrial working class. This particular section of the workforce hadn't existed long enough to have a clear identity all its own, but like the farmers, workers in the railroads and factories and mines and other new businesses were disgruntled for several reasons. Though their wages were typically higher than what they would have made on the farm, it was not enough, many of them believed, to compensate for the demanding and often dangerous labor they were called on to perform. And on these new factory floors, surrounded by lots of fast-moving and complicated machinery, which they didn't always understand, they often felt like cogs in a machine themselves. They wanted higher wages, they wanted shorter hours, 8 or 10 per day, as opposed to the 12 or 14 or more they frequently faced, and they wanted better working conditions. To this end, the formation of labor unions and the occasional strike had occurred as early as the 1870s, but it really ramped up during the following decade, with chapters of national workers' organizations like the Knights of Labor being formed and strikes becoming increasingly frequent and high profile. The railroad yards at North Little Rock were a particular scene of action, with a massive strike in 1883 and the damaging of a number of locomotives in 1886. These strikes were generally unsuccessful, resulting in nothing more than the firing of the workers themselves, but that did not put an end to labor agitation, and in the wake of these events, union leaders and agrarian activists decided to join forces, uniting under a single banner that would advocate the interests of both. The upshot of all this was the formation of the Union Labor Party in 1888, incorporating the Agricultural Wheel, the Knights of Labor, and other similar groups, making all the demands we've already run through, and adding such popular causes of the time as monetary reform, getting more inflation in the economy essentially, regulation of monopolies, and creation of departments of agriculture and labor by the state government. In short, for almost the first time in Arkansas history, there was a concerted call for a drastic expansion in the size and the authority of the government. Nominating for the gubernatorial election that same year a former state legislator and Confederate veteran, Charles Norwood, the Union Labor Party marked the most serious challenge to Democratic control of the state since Reconstruction. The appeal to the lower classes, across lines of occupation and even race, was certainly having an effect, and the Republicans decided to back the new party rather than compete with it. In the end, though, this coalition reform movement would come up short for a variety of reasons. By trying to have such a big tent, as it were, the party wound up alienating some factions of purists within both the farmer and worker camps, and this cost it some support. At the same time, the Democratic candidate, James P. Eagle, himself a Confederate veteran, appealed to his party's traditional position as defenders of the South and of the state's legacy as part of the Confederacy, and many voters were unwilling to abandon it for that reason. He also pointed to the party's conservatism on taxes and government spending, which, while not popular with the reformists, had done a great deal to restore Arkansas's financial stability after Reconstruction. All this mattered, and then too, they resorted to fraud and intimidation in many localities, simply falsifying returns on Election Day. In the end, Eagle and the Democrats triumphed, but by a remarkably slim margin, with only about 54% of the vote officially, and some scholars believe that if not for the voter fraud which did undoubtedly take place, Norwood would have won the election. The close call the Democrats experienced in the 1888 election made them determined to prevent such a thing from happening again, and how they went about it dovetails with what we discussed at the end of the last video. There were a number of ways its leaders in Little Rock tried to defuse the threat from the Union Labor coalition posed, endorsing a few of its proposals, such as monetary reform and further regulation of railroads, as well as supporting the growth of other agrarian groups that, unlike the Wheel, were explicitly non-political. But one of the most important was the decision to exploit racial tensions in the state. These tensions were already present, of course, thanks to the aftermath of slavery, Civil War, and Reconstruction, and the effects of the spread of sharecropping. But while there was no specific argument made to this effect, Democratic leaders seem to have decided that they could use those tensions among white voters to support the disenfranchisement of African Americans along the lines we went over previously. That would cut out a significant element of the Union Labor Party's voting base, and any white voters who supported this budding Jim Crow system would become loyal members of the Democratic Party as a result, if they weren't already. In 1889, Democratic newspapers began encouraging a policy of disenfranchisement, and in 1891, the same year that law for segregation of railroad coaches was passed, marking the actual beginning of Jim Crow in the state, a new election law was also pushed through, placing heavy restrictions on the ability of illiterate voters to cast their ballots. As I said before, some poor white voters were netted by these restrictions too, but since a majority of black voters still could not read or write, that was going to make a serious difference. During the early 1890s, the number of votes cast by black citizens plummeted, and it was at this time that they also ceased to hold office on the state or county level too, except on very rare occasions. As a result of these and other measures, Arkansas Democrats were able to put an end to the threat posed by the Union Labor Party and the lower class reform movement more generally. The party would mount serious challenges in the 1890 and 1892 elections as well, but as the effect of these tactics, disenfranchisement above all else, began to be felt, its strength steadily declined over the rest of the decade. Party leaders attempted several different means of reversing the trend, including renewed alliances with the Republicans and, after 1892, rebranding themselves the Populist Party as the state branch of the larger national party of that name. By 1900, though, with the Democrats regularly winning two-thirds of the vote or more in statewide elections once again, it was clear that the reformers' attempt to win political power outright had failed. So from many angles, it appeared that the protest movement launched by farmers and workers had had no positive impact on conditions in the state. Degrading conditions like sharecropping certainly hadn't gone away. What few reforms had been passed had been mainly a bone tossed to the wheel or union labor or whoever, and in the end, the Democratic leadership had retained its hold on power. To be sure, members of that leadership genuinely believed these proposals were dangerous to the state's economic future and needed to be kept in check, but regardless, shooting them down certainly did nothing for the state of mind of Arkansans who had put their hopes in these ideas. Moreover, Democrats had accomplished all this in large part by playing the white supremacist card and squelching the political rights of African Americans, which in the long run was at least as destructive to race relations in the state as anything that had happened during Reconstruction. Starting with the election of James P. Clark as governor in 1894, the first governor since the end of Reconstruction not to be a former Confederate, and thus considered to mark the end of the Redeemer era, state politicians would, for the next two generations, make openly racist appeals to win elections, with Clark pledging that the Democratic Party would maintain, quote, white standards of civilization. Daniel Jones, elected in 1896, and Jeff Davis, elected in 1900, would say much the same thing, with Davis becoming especially notorious in that regard. However, the reformers could not be said to have been totally defeated. Even if such policies as added regulation of the railroads were adopted mainly to steal their thunder, still they were adopted and represented a break on the power of big business that had drawn such resentment from many people. And it wasn't as though, once their third-party efforts had been defeated, the reformers just went away. Instead, most of them returned to the Democratic fold and tried to work from the inside, swaying the party in their direction. And to an extent, they succeeded. Governors of the 1890s and 1900s, like Clark, Jones, and Davis, endorsed such populist causes as currency inflation and campaigned on platforms not only of racial bigotry, but also of standing up to big business and the Wall Street elites thought to be exploiting the people. Davis, in particular, would follow this up with some so-called antitrust laws, aimed at breaking up powerful industrial monopolies in the state. All in all, then, one can say that the 1890s and 1900s did not mark simply the defeat of the reform cause, but rather were a transition into the progressive era of the 1900s and 1910s, in which there would once again be serious agitation for social and political change in Arkansas.